This is Anthony Pascal.
And this is Laurie Elster, and this is the All Access Star Trek podcast. Today we're going to be reviewing Strange New Worlds, Season 2, Episode 4, Among the Lotus Eaters. But we're going to start with the news, as we always do, which is there's no official word, well, there's no word at all, on a new home for Star Trek Prodigy, but the producers have been saying nothing specific. I would say just general sort of vague positive things that tells me that there are some discussions or hope for discussions. And in the meantime, the show was nominated for a Television Critics Association Award.
Which is a pretty big deal. It was nominated for Outstanding Family Programming. They've been doing these awards since the 80s, and Star Trek, the only award Star Trek has ever won is a Legacy Award a few years ago. But, it's just a good sign for Emmy possibility, which we'll know later in the year when the family Emmys come up.
And it gives it a nice profile in the industry, which is always good. It's up against some big shows. American Born Chinese, which I haven't seen yet. Never Have I Ever, which I've seen every second of, maybe more than once. A bunch of others. So I think this can only help, right?
Yeah, it'll probably help. Yeah, I'm sure that it gets mentioned as they're shopping it around to Netflix and Amazon, which I think are the number 1 and number 2 possible future homes for the series.
Yeah, and they'll be announcing the winners on August 7th. So we'll keep an ear out for that.
We'll be in Vegas.
We will.
As will the Prodigy crew.
So it'll be good news for everybody, we hope.
There is
bad news for Canada.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, so in Canada, Star Trek has a unique situation in Canada where it's the only country in the world where the new Star Trek shows are actually broadcast on like real TV. So Bell Media in Canada broadcasts them on CTV Sci-Fi. They've been doing this since Discovery. And then they show up on Bell Media's streaming service, which is called Crave, which, according to most Canadians I've heard from, is not a great streaming service. But what are you going to do? And so they've announced that all the Star Trek shows, they have the legacy shows too, are all leaving by the end of August, with the exception of Strange New Worlds, which is still running, obviously. And that'll be leaving in the fall. So, but they're still going to broadcast on CTV. So Lower Decks probably later on. They're just kind of cutting it in half. I haven't got to confirm yet, but I'm almost sure it's just going to show up on Paramount Plus. So
I would assume it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, Paramount Plus in Canada is the only Paramount Plus in the world that doesn't have Star Trek. So they've already pulled some Showtime stuff off of Crave, and that's now on Paramount Plus, shows like Dexter and that. So it makes sense, but we can't confirm that yet.
You know, Canada, my homeland, we like to be different. We like to stand out in the crowd.
I still think it's cool that you could just watch Star Trek just like you used to. Except it's cable TV, but still. It's like on actual TV. You have to look it up in the schedule and everything.
Reminds me of my childhood.
So we're 2 weeks away from Comic-Con, and what I wish I could do now is tell you what Paramount is doing at Comic-Con. This year's been kind of a mixed bag from a lot of companies. Marvel has finally decided they're going to go. Some people aren't going. I'm almost certain. I know Paramount's going. They've got a booth, a Star Trek booth. I think that they're calling it a Strange New Worlds booth. I guess it's just going to, have some kind of Star Trek Strange New Worlds experience, maybe like a transporter room. They've done stuff like that before.
Cool.
But we don't know what they've got going on with panels yet. But keep checking at TrekMovie. We should know very soon. By the time this podcast comes out, they may have already announced. It'll be interesting to see what shows and what celebrities they're bringing to San Diego this year.
Yeah, we will interpret what we can from their choice. Plus, it'll be easier to find than combing through the whole schedule and all the articles, because we'll put all the Star Trek stuff in one place on our site.
I mean, we do know a little bit about merchandise. There's a few Star Trek exclusives, as there are every year. Nothing major, some tchotchke, like literally keychains. I'm excited about
pins and bottle openers.
Yeah. I mean, I'm excited about this book from John Tenuto, who's a friend of the site. And that there's a special version of that coming out early from Titan Publishing and some other stuff.
we do have an exclusive clip on the site from a new docuseries, actually also by friends of TrekMovie, a bunch of friends of TrekMovie. It's called Greatest Geek Year Ever 1982, a docuseries about all the sci-fi and amazing films that came out in 1982, which was just a crazy year for very, very big movies. It's Mark A. Altman is one of the producers, our friend Scott Mantz. Who else is on that list?
Roger Lay is the director on this. The guy who did the Roddenberry Vault has done a lot of special features for Star Trek. It started a couple years ago. I think we talked about this on the podcast as a crowdfunding thing.
We had Mark on. Mark came on the podcast and told us all about it.
What I like is it's become a docu-series. So this is what we've been saying with the Voyager people. If you got a lot of content, turn it into a series. It's going to be a 4-part docu-series airing on regular TV, the CW.
Yeah.
So every weekend this July, every Saturday this July, a new episode of Greatest Geek Year Ever, 1982. That's the name. So, and so we got a clip of Shatner and Nick Meyer talking about Star Trek 2 with a bunch of other people, like super fans, but important super fans, like Dean Devlin, talking about how important it is to him. And Mark Guggenheim, who created the Arrowverse shows, and he's writing that new Star Trek, the motion picture comic. He's talking about it. So it's cool. And we got a clip of Mantz in there just talking about how important 1982 is and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's cool. I'm happy for them that they sold it to the CW. I know it had done some film festivals and things, so that's exciting.
Let's talk a little Strange New Worlds. I think that's it for the news.
How about a little Strange New Worlds controversy?
Oh. What's the skinny? What's so controversial?
Well, you wrote it, so...
Oh, really?
So Akiva had given an interview where he was talking about how the timing of the eugenics wars has changed in Star Trek canon, and was giving an explanation for it. And the sort of core of his explanation was that Star Trek is an aspirational future, and that Gene Roddenberry wanted it to be, I think this is the gist of his argument, wanted it to be rooted in our reality, to think of it as our future, not as some crazy sci-fi thing, but as like, this could be our future. And so since the time when they were supposed to happen, which was the 90s, has come and gone and they didn't happen, it's been sort of retconned that they happened later. And Akiva says this is sort of to keep the original vision intact.
There's a practical side to this. Is let's say you're just some random person watching the show and someone mentions the eugenics wars from the 1990s. You'll be thinking, what eugenics wars? And it would actually take you out of the show, or certainly take you out of the reality the show is our future, because there was no such thing. I'm totally fine with this. I believe in Gene's vision of the future, of Star Trek being in our future, even though we have a dark period to go through before that. One could argue, well, if you're going to retcon this, you need to retcon every mention of everything that hasn't happened, because there's
lots. Yeah.
This isn't the only thing between 1966 and 2023 that hasn't happened on time, as it were. But I think this is a big one, and it's tied to Lon's story. So I'm fine with this. And I think most fans are, but some fans aren't, and I get it.
Well, because to some degree, I mean, I don't actually care what year it happened. To me, isn't the important part of the story. But I can understand fans being like, what? Why do you have to do, you don't have to do that. We're smart enough to go, okay, well, the original statement about when it all happened was a few decades before the 90s. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? So
right.
I could see that argument.
Reconfirming that it's in the 1990s, I could see is problematic. Being completely vague about it, it just kind of happened at some point. But if they wanted Lon to meet young Khan, they kind of had to pick a time. They couldn't keep it vague. It was, because the 1990s don't look like the mid 21st century. They kind of had no choice if they wanted that moment, which they obviously did.
Right, which is, then people get into that argument of, did they need that moment? But they wanted it, they did it, they found a way to do it. They explained it in the episode as sort of like time writes itself. These things still find a way of happening, which kind of goes against all the don't change time. Anyway,
well, but they use the The Temple Cold War gives them the like big hand wave. They just wave Temple Cold War over things. Like, well, that's just the Temple Cold War. It's kind of like, that old joke of just say it was wizards that did it,
Right.
It's
Well,
it's
it's
just,
like Janeway saying it gives me a headache. It's the same thing. You don't have to have the conversation.
I'm fine with it. I kind of liked it, actually. He's been cavalier about canon, but in this weird way, I feel like he's really trying to respect canon in a weird way here in his
Yeah, I
mind.
mean, it's funny because everybody's vision of what canon is and what part of it matters is kind of different.
Yeah.
Right. So half the people saying it doesn't matter, half the people saying it matters so much and you screwed it up, and then another chunk who are fine with it. So of all the things I've, crabbed about, that isn't one that bothers me. I think it's fine and the explanation works for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a list of other things, but but that one's fine. And I like the idea behind it of thinking about how Gene Roddenberry did think of Star Trek being our future.
Yeah.
Like to think of it in a very concrete way as it's aspirational, not just because the values are what we want, but because saying we could become better. That's the message. And that's the key. It's our history.
And that is something that has really, I think that it's an enduring part of Star Trek. I can remember talking to J.J. Abrams about that, like that. J.J. was never deeply, ingrained in the lore of Star Trek, but he got that. He got that it was our future. And, remember that first teaser trailer for Star Trek 2009 that started with the JFK speech?
I do not.
Oh, well, I'll have to link that in the show notes, but that was why they did that. They were trying to link our past and our present to this future to show that Star Trek is different than Star Wars and other sci-fi. It's all part of our future.
Right. I mean, Star Wars starts with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So it's basically telling you, like, this has all happened. It's legend. It's something else.
I also, as I said last week, I said I was going to do an article about the painting that Pelia stole. And I wrote up a thing about that, which is just kind of
fun.
I do think it's fun that this Star Trek isn't the first show that did it. The Simpsons did this, other shows. There's a picture of like the same painting in a Simpsons episode. So it's a time-honored tradition now to solve the case of the thing I can't figure out is it was stolen from the Gardner Museum in Boston. Why did they keep on talking about the Louvre? I can only think that the Louvre is famous. Like someone said, no one's ever.
That's what I think. Yeah.
Make it the Louvre. No one will know the difference.
Nobody knows the other one. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I don't get all, shaking my fist at the sky about that either.
Man shakes fist at cloud. Simpsons reference.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, I think we could actually talk about this week's episode.
We should.
Before we shake our fists at any clouds. I mean, I liked it. In a weird way, I had a similar experience that you had last week where my first playthrough, I was like, why are they going back to Rigel 7? I want to, we're 4 episodes in. Let's get some strange new worlds.
I know.
But then I started getting what they, that this is a Pike episode for the most part. And it's important to him, not just because it's in his past, but, he feels guilty over it. And then they found a way to tie that into his current relationship. It created an interesting opportunity, harkening to old Star Trek episodes and PTSD and a lot of interesting things. So I liked it. Not the best episode of the season, but it was a solid episode, good Pike episode, good Ortegas episode. So that's my high level. What do you think?
So my high level is, I thought it was a really good idea for a story. There was some really good stuff in there. There was a fun premise. The memory loss thing was cool. I liked the leaving someone behind and what happens. All of that is good. I thought, and the way that it unfolded piece by piece, I thought was done very, very nicely. As always, there were holes in the execution of it where you just stop short and you go, how did this happen? And I thought that the romance subplot, I just didn't care about at all. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't care if Pike has that. I'd rather Pike was out there meeting randos and having fun sexual experiences than I don't care that he's like difficult in relationships and he pushes people. I don't know. To me, that wasn't a thing. They don't have a lot of chemistry in my book, those two. There's nothing wrong with her. She's fine. I don't get their connection. 2 more big overview points. I thought the directing was great. I thought everything looked really good and you You know, you felt like you were there for the most part. But it was the third episode out of 4 this season where there's a whole big punching scene, and that's where the conflict in this one is ultimately resolved. And it was especially brutal.
I mean, the first kind of fight scene where they got into the palace was quick.
No, it wasn't that one. It was the big one at the end.
Right.
Like,
Well,
fighting guards makes sense.
the one at the end, again, gets to this profound issue. And this is like more than just a fight.
It's not a fight. He's beating the crap out of him.
Right. What they were saying in this episode is when you're stripped from your memories, it reveals who you really are.
Yeah. So what kind of a message is that? That's who Pike is? Like a brutal thug? That's who he is?
Well, I'm not sure thug is the,
Well,
he's
not
willing,
thug, but he was brutal.
but he's violent. He has violent tendencies. He's willing to fight because he feels like he's fighting for someone he cares about, someone he loves. He's confused as to exactly who or what. Because he thinks he cares about La'an to get her help, and he knows that he needs to get back to someone he loves, which is the whole pendant thing. And he's willing to do anything to make that happen. And it's an interesting question that I think Pike is now wrestling with is he a violent man? And you remember there was an interview with Anson a while ago where he talked about how this show is going to test these kinds of limits. And maybe there's a message here that the Starfleet layer has civilized, because as soon as he remembered, he's like, oh, right, I'm Starfleet. I'm not going to hurt you. That's not what we do. We're Starfleet. I'm a civilized man, and we're going to arrest you, and you're going to have to pay for what you did. I think it's it raises interesting questions.
I thought it was a terrible choice. There are all kinds of ways to have raised those questions without actually having him just punch the shit out of him. It was nasty. And it was also just, if that's who Pike is, then I like him less now. Like we've argued about, there's, a lot of people argue about Kirk and I've written articles and whatever saying like, he's not the punching guy that he gets portrayed as. Like, yeah, he can fight and he has to fight, but he doesn't always go right to the punching. That's not who he is. But apparently now that's who Pike is.
Well, I mean, but isn't this very, the enemy within, where this is inside of him? And, maybe there's a little bit of that inside of all of us. That guy was talking about how, when you strip away the memories, anger persists, love persists, that these emotions that, you can be taken over by emotions. That's all I don't think it was necessarily saying Pike is this angry, brutal brute guy, but that the way this planet affects you can certainly reveal that side of you and raise it to become everything, because you don't have the rest. You don't have your memories, your personality, your civilization, essentially.
To me, it still doesn't work. Like that doesn't gel for me, because it's saying, that like, I get that who he is the guy who fights for the people that he loves, but he was just punching, and it was the brutality of it that was extreme to me.
Yeah, I get it.
I mean, that's the end. We're already at the very end of the podcast is over. We're done. But and also it was the third of 4 episodes that had big punching stuff again. And I'm like, okay, could we maybe try to solve a problem without all the punching? Let's hope the rest of the episodes don't just have that again.
There was an interesting mix of smarts and just kind of raw intuition solving the problems on the Enterprise, though. So at least there was no violence when everyone forgot who they were. They didn't descend into chaos. They just all started wandering around, staring at the walls, going, "Where the hell am I?"
Right, like there was the scared guy in the corner. So, but no, and even at the beginning, when Pike and M'Benga and La'an lost their memories, they were still who they were. Like they lost their memories, but they're sort of they're figuring out they have a connection to each other. Pike immediately becomes a leader. That's who he is. And so he's leading, and he's even though his thought process is being hampered by this radiation, he's still trying to focus and trying to use it. And he's able to he looks at his hands and goes, oh, I have these soft hands, therefore I'm not a laborer. Nobody goes, and what's all that mousse in your hair? Which nobody noticed, which I thought was funny because I would have noticed that first. But, I thought that stuff was all really good and putting the pieces together. And that tells me who they were. Like La'an wants to immediately attack. They're like, no, wait, that's not the right, they're doing all that. So that to me worked. And I enjoyed the stuff on the ship when people were forgetting who they were. I like the moment where Ortegas sees Chapel and gets and sort of lights up, and then Chapel just breezes on by.
So, but getting back, I think this is an interesting thing about, so let's go back to the beginning. So we got Battelle and Pike relationship, because this is another interesting thing that's been handled differently on different Star Treks of how do we want our captain to handle his relationships? Like Janeway ended up being a monk practically, except for that Irish thing.
She had a few, but almost nothing. Nothing. Well, because she was with someone, she was engaged at the beginning of the show.
And, Picard was married to the ship with a little bit of dalliance with Vash, and, a whole other series where they had to spend a whole season just to get him to admit he liked someone.
And then he forgot about her. and then she's still waiting for him in the bar. Kirk was in love with his ship, but had a lot of fun things and met his soulmate when he time traveled.
But Sisko made it work.
Mm-hmm.
He could find, because, so what kind of captain do we, and Michael Burnham's making it work.
Right. And that has to me, that's a spicy, exciting one. I just love those two together. I think they have tremendous chemistry also. I think the idea of saying like, oh, captains would date each other because they would understand is certainly a valid and interesting idea, but it just isn't interesting to watch. Like it's just not. And they aren't interesting to watch, and I'm not invested in them. And definitely the whole pushing people at whatever, this is how I am. And I like this talk with Una. I was like, can we get to the story now?
I mean, I do like that how Una is kind of in a new place. She is who she is now. And so she's giving advice about not to feel guilt about Rigel 7. And she's throwing out, advice about relationship advice. Like maybe, you should have it all. You could be a captain, but you could still have joy in your life. So, and she was doing a good job running the ship until she forgot who she was.
Well, she sort of, there was one questionable moment, I thought. So here, like, this is the kind of thing where the show creates a situation and then sort of messes up their own delivery of it. So they say, Ortegas, she's so excited to go on the mission. They need her to fly the shuttle. She's joining the landing party. Oh, now we need her to fly the Enterprise. You better stay. You're the only one who can do it. So she stays in the Enterprise, and then Uhura gets sick, and Una says, why don't you go with her to sickbay? And I'm thinking, isn't she the only one who can fly the ship? Like, why would you want her to leave the bridge when you've made the point that she has to stay, but now she can go accompany someone to sickbay? There's like 4 other people sitting there. There's a ship full of people, but only she can take her. And it's because they wanted her in sickbay for that scene.
Yeah.
And then Una's like, I can fly the ship, no problem. And I'm like, okay, well,
they only needed an adjustment every 20 minutes, they said. So they expected her back in time.
Well, let's hope she'd just done one right before it. Again, it just was like, you guys are the ones who made the big deal about it. And then you changed it. So that's where I go, you could have just not made, there was another way to do it, or it didn't have to be her in sickbay. But either way.
But regardless of that, I think they handled the Ortegas arc well. She starts off literally saying flying the ship gets boring.
Yep.
And by the end, she realizes like, wow, actually it's not boring.
And the moment when she realized it was her who had to do it, it was great. She went from cowering and being afraid to being told, no, you're the one who can save everybody. And she's like, hell yeah, I'm the one who saves everybody. And she got up and did it. I thought all that stuff was fun, and she was great. And I loved Spock's plan of like, here, I'm going to give everybody a pad with the information on it that says who you are, but I would have actually hung them around people's necks.
I was thinking you should like strap them to their arms.
Yes,
or something, because
a strap, something would have made a little more. I know he was improvising. There wasn't a lot of time, but I would have gone for some Velcro, something to just attach it.
This episode was a lot about people making mistakes, and it's nice coming in episode 2. Everyone, all of these characters were a little bit perfect. They were essentially chiding Starfleet admirals for not being perfect enough, and now they're all making mistakes. Pike made a mistake when he was on the last time. He left way too much stuff behind, obviously.
A lot of stuff. He brought too much stuff and then left it there. Yeah.
And Spock totally blew it by his plan to go into the asteroid field. Really bad idea.
Yeah.
So people were making mistakes, learning from their mistakes. I liked that.
And yet, what I really liked was they did something in the show that most Star Treks don't do, was that Uhura says, "Oh, I'm feeling weird and I lost 2 hours," and tells them, and they go to sickbay, because I feel like so many Star Treks, someone experiences something and then they do what La'an did. They go, "I'm fine." Like,
Right.
La'an doesn't mention, "I don't remember the last 6 hours." She just doesn't tell them that she doesn't remember. She's like, "I had a headache. I'm lightheaded." She doesn't say the last 6 hours or a complete blank. So,
Right.
and
When they plug her in sickbay and her brain is, going off like a Christmas tree, it's completely screwed up.
yeah,
So
yeah.
she was way messed up, and she just happened to be the first before everyone started.
And it wasn't the oatmeal.
Yeah.
I thought
And
that
I
was
guess Una's genetic engineering, like I thought she was going to start glowing and like, because usually in one of these
fun.
situations,
Yep, I know where you're
there's
going.
always someone. There's Odo or Seven or Spock
yeah.
or someone's immune to the kooky
Data.
space thing. Right. And in this one, what they did is no one was immune, but Ortegas had such instinct because they couldn't even read. That was a little weird. Spock couldn't even read his own pad, which made his idea essentially wrong again.
No,
but
and it didn't sort of fit with the whole explanation of the things you retain, because they all would have learned to read long before they learned to fly ships and cure people. And
But it showed how amazing it was that even not able to read, she had such pure instinct that she could overcome. So in a sense, she was immune. Her data-like superpower was just her. She was the only one who was, doing anything. Although I guess Chapel said she could like dress a wound because she's done it a million.
She was just roaming around.
Yeah, but she definitely left sickbay, so she wasn't doing anything.
Yeah, she wasn't. She forgot. She said she'd forget that she knew how to do it. That's what she said. I like that they gave her the explanation of how the whole thing worked. That was good.
Because this is a lot like Conundrum, right? Obviously.
But without the fun doing it part.
See, I was thinking that Spock and Chapel are gonna find each other in the hallway and go, "Wait, I don't remember anything except I really like you.
I like you." Yeah.
And they were gonna go off somewhere and reconnect.
Conundrum is a big favorite episode of mine. I love that one.
So but I'm kind of glad they didn't do that.
Yeah, I think tonally it wasn't a good match for what was going on. This was a pretty serious episode that raised some big, like aside from the holes, which we'll get to. I think the big story was a great one. Like, one, the guilt about crew members who died. Like, he was haunted by that, as I would hope most captains are haunted by those things. The idea of a guy who got left behind that nobody knew about, who decided to become king, was a good story. You start to lose your memory, and there's a whole class of people who keep their memories and a class of people who don't. All that stuff was super interesting. Yeah, and I loved the guy Luke, who just was so, like, when he showed up, I just put in my notes, he seems very nice. Like, he was so like, be in the moment, I'm going to get you through it, it's going to be fine. He was like your guide if you were doing some weird psychedelic drug for the first time. Like, that's the guy you'd want next to you.
He was very zen, and I like for most of the time he's like, just deal with it. Just
it's okay.
Pound the rocks, be a slave. This is our life. You'll get used to it. And then La'an's dying, and it's like, don't worry, she's gonna die. It's fine.
She was like, I'm not dead yet. Like, she just kept saying, please stop saying I'm dying. Could you stop?
But then when Pike was so passionate, he immediately kind of saw that, and he's like, this is your moment. This is your truth. So you know what? I'm gonna go with that now. And so he's so zen that he's like, okay, now we're doing this. So he was great.
Yeah, I
Very,
really
very
liked him.
good actor. He's one of those guys like, oh, I know I've seen him in Succession and this and that. But he is a really good actor. He's a Tony Award winner. His name is Reed Birney.
He pushed handmaids off the roof in Handmaid's Tale. He was so horrible. So
I'm not holding him responsible for that, but yes.
No. I've seen him play like crazies and villains. So that was, he was terrific. I bought it right away, who he was, everything about him.
Certainly the Zacharias character was interesting. He was the yeoman, so there was a connection to Pike.
With a line right out of the cage where he says, like, my yeoman, 3 crew members include my yeoman, and then he says there were 7 others who were injured or something, which is why they had to run off and get them taken care of.
This episode, it's like a lot of Strange New Worlds episode, is almost a mashup of different Star Treks, because you've got elements of Patterns of Force, the Nazi planet here, where a guy kind of goes native and affects the planet, in that case turning them all into Nazis, which was not a smart move. And and there's a few other episodes about culture contamination, and again, this is all, it's not copying them, but you could feel the echoes, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
No, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think this had definitely like the vibe of a good classic Star Trek episode.
It's a little Patterns of Force, with a little conundrum thrown in there, and
it's a sprinkling of this and a dash of that. So, and some good smart moments, like when Pike hears, oh, there's, we lose our memories all the time, but the people don't, who are in the palace or whatever. First they say we lose our memories all the time. Pike says, how does society work? Like, he asks the right question, which I appreciate. And that's when he finds out the rest.
What did you think of his line when they wake up after they've been sent out of the palace, and he says, "This is a cage"? I just started bursting out laughing, and I don't know if they wanted me to laugh, if they realized it was so meta that I just couldn't.
I think that's why they put them in a cage that looked like a cage, because they could have locked them up anywhere, but they deliberately put them in a cage.
But then he said the line.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a minor thing. The one bit of connection I would have appreciated, it's a minor thing, but when they showed the picture of the crewmen from 5 years ago, they were all wearing the new uniforms. It would have been nice to have seen them in either cage turtlenecks or Discovery uniforms or something to show that they weren't in the new uniforms.
Yeah.
And I'm shocked because there was the costume people didn't pick up on that. Maybe they didn't know what the uniforms were for that they're dressing these 3 characters in.
Yeah, that's very possible.
Because they made some fantastic costumes, I thought, for the locals and for the Starfleet people who were pretending to be Kalar.
Yep.
I thought the production design, the castle looked great. My only real quip with the production design, the uniform thing is so minor. It's not a quip, but this is one of those episodes where I don't think they did a very good job with the AR wall.
Yeah.
I mean, unless it was such an homage to the original series when it was like you could see the back wall and shadows on the back wall. I mean, because it was that obvious to me. I don't know if it is to everyone, but you could like see the curve of the wall where the studio snow stopped and the CGI snow started. The show has done better stuff with the AR wall recently, so.
But I still thought overall, like the directing, which, it's interesting, the guy who directed this was the co-writer and co-director of the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, crazy.
Interesting guy. Like, he's done a lot of horror and things like that.
There must be an interesting story about how he ended up directing Star Trek, because he's a big Star Trek fan.
Yeah, he did a film in college, a goofy parody film.
Yeah, and I thought he did a good job. I mean, it's more with the emotional stuff. You'd think you'd bring him on to do, a horror episode, but there really wasn't much horror to this. Even though the Kalar in the original, series,
were they big in the original? Weren't they like very
they were
large?
big and kind of monstrous and goofy teeth and
big hats to make them look even bigger.
Well, they did like have an explanation. The hats had a reason. Or at least for the guards, because the guards were outside the perimeter, but that they had hats that protected their memories. So the helmets,
helmets, but it was like a big tall, in the original series was like a big tall hat, and they were supposed to be, I think they filmed it at these angles so that it would look like, oh, he's much bigger than
Yeah,
Pike,
yeah.
which they just dropped. I mean, again, which I say you could, I understand there's something cool about taking that line of dialogue about the people that they lost, but you could have done the same story, not tied yourself to that particular history and just been like, oh, it was a mission that he was on where he lost people. It didn't have to be Rigel 7.
No, it didn't have to be, but that was my first reaction. Why not give us a new planet? But I was fine with it. I liked the look of the palace. They kind of took the original beautiful Whitlock matte painting and then created this huge tower that we didn't see because it was off to the right. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, ultimately that didn't bog me down particularly, mostly because we didn't know enough about it for it to keep, slamming into something that didn't make sense. It wasn't necessary, but it didn't bother me.
In a sense, this is another case where they're sort of not fixing canon, but adding something to it, because in the 24th century, Rigel 7 was a tourist destination.
So they fixed it up. They fixed it up good.
So now we kind of know how they set it on the right course, I guess, because that society would never evolve with the way things were going.
No. Although I was curious to know how they, before, Zach got there, King Zacharias, before he arrived, or whatever, the Lord of whatever, how did they figure out that the palace was, how did they figure all that out?
Well, I imagine someone left the palace area and then lost their memory and somehow came back and got it back.
Yeah.
And they figured there's something inside the walls, and let's put that stuff in our helmets and then we'll be fine. They
probably tried a lot of other hats before they figured out what the right one was.
It all comes down to the hats. So here's a Prime Directive question. Do you feel that Pike violated or didn't violate? Because Spock was kind of weird about that. Like, he's like, because they were fixing the planet. They were taking the asteroid away, and Pike said that's not natural. Like, asteroids are natural. Asteroids crash into planets.
Well, so the bigger issue for me is that should have been a bigger conversation. Like, that is kind of what Star Trek is often about, is that kind of conversation. There are a lot of different points of view there. And I personally think, yes, like, you see that that's happened to a planet, then it's good. Then as long as Starfleet doesn't show themselves and that contamination had already happened, then yeah, you should, that's the right thing to do, is to fix it. And then and then there's a big debate. Is it sort of natural? I mean, lots of things are natural, but maybe it's about their natural development. Their natural development was hindered by this asteroid. They would not have developed that way. So it was the asteroid that you could say interfered with their...
Right. Even though it's a natural asteroid, I would say it's by the 24th century, I think they got a little stricter in what they considered meddling.
These are the early days of the Prime Directive and figuring it out.
Yeah. And, they already, screwed this planet up. It almost felt like, a little payback, a little, well,
it's the least we can do.
Did they tear down the topiary garden shaped like the Delta on their way
they
out?
were going to. That also, I thought that was weird that Pike goes, well, you were sending me a message, right? And he basically says, no, that was an accident or something. Like, he's saying, oh, they took my symbol and they turned it into something. We shouldn't have done that.
Except that the symbol was like on the flags next to him.
Huge. I mean, it was again, these weird throwaway things that don't quite connect, that I go, what? Okay. Zach is just kind of like, eh.
It's interesting how he felt like he was too far gone, that he'd gone total Colonel Kurtz and there was no turning back for him. But Pike said, no, we'll take you back. Prisoner, I guess. But
yeah. He's going to jail. You can't, that's like one of the worst things you can do,
I guess. But they did leave him behind. They did leave him behind. I mean,
I know, but he was, again, so they thought he was like, how you didn't personally verify that I died. And I'm like, how is the captain supposed to go personally? Like, if they said he blew up or however he was supposed to.
They always say leave no man behind, find his body and try to get it back. They didn't bother. But for some reason, they had to get Spock to the Vega colony. They couldn't fix Spock on the ship. So, we're randomly jumping around things. I want to randomly bring up something that I liked in this episode because it solves is a strong word, but it picks up on something that I know bugged you in season 1, where there's a moment when Spock says some techno babble and La'an throws back at him, "Can't you just speak in plain English?"
Yeah, I was annoyed by that.
And in this episode, he says, he talks about how, there's all this debris, and she says, "Can't you just say 2 moons?" And he says, "I could, but that would be leaping to a conclusion." I'm not sure they meant it this way, but I took it as a case where he's now more confident to tell her, "This is how I talk. I'm a scientist,"
Here
And
was the other thing I thought about that line. I don't know if I just put that there, but I think they did. Like, we've seen him wrestling with feelings, and maybe now he seems in this episode seemed like he was trying very much to be more Vulcan. Like, I thought his whole manner was him trying to do that.
well, but then he apologizes to Ortegas, which is not something I think a Vulcan might do because she wasn't able to go on the mission. And then she says, "Sometimes, Spock, you need to know just when to not say anything." And he said, "I'm working on it," or something like that.
So I decided to take that. I decided to add my own stuff to that and say that he is making these decisions. So he's trying to be more Vulcan. And then he gets this reminder of like, that's what you just did was annoying. And then he has a moment of being human. But he seems more calmed down in this episode overall.
Okay.
I thought of something else I liked in this episode, which was that on the planet that they created a mythology from their physical circumstances, which I thought was a very old school, Gene Roddenberry would have loved it kind of idea, which was they keep our memories like in a box or in a chest, or that's this whole mythology came to be simply because of the physical circumstances. It was cool.
There's an element of this episode with this society, which is a caste system society, cloud miners, and other episodes we've seen this. And there could be an element here of a theme we've seen this season of misinformation and divided societies. I think is something that's come up over and over again this season. I don't, maybe I'm reading too much into things.
Well, I think this had a different vibe from those. Like, I think keeping factions warring against each other for someone else's interest was more the theme that they were exploring in other episodes. And this one was really like this guy Zach took advantage of an existing system so that he could be in the winning group of the two. I mean, one group was winning.
Right, but whoever created those totems and that mythology, it was all part of oppressing the lower caste, I think, and giving them a lot of that mythology was BS, which Zach started laughing about it all at the end. He's like, "Oh, that's all fake." Whoever made up that story just made up that story to keep those people in line, which you saw when Luke finally came inside the palace, remembered his life, and he's like, "Oh my God, I totally shouldn't have felt that way. I miss, my son, my dead son." And
it was a survival mechanism too. So
yeah.
It all just kind of fit together. It is sort of how you might make sense of your world. If you were one of those people who were losing your memories, you might start to make sense of your world in that way and be like, "Oh, I guess those people have their memories in a box somewhere."
Well, and they had their totem and they had their tattoos, which reminded me of that Christopher Nolan movie Memento with Guy Pearce, where he tattooed things on himself so he could remember
he kept
things.
Forgetting. Yeah, that was a good movie.
They're borrowing. There's a little bit of a Wizard of Oz, where they're like, "Let's go to the palace and get our memories back." And when Ortegas is on the ship and the ship goes, essentially follow the Yellow Brick Road.
Follow the Yellow Brick Road to find your quarters. Yeah, I thought there were elements of that for sure.
We learned a good amount about Erica. I'm curious if they'd ever give her like an A story like they did with La'an last week, with, a full-on Ortegas episode. Because there was no Ortegas story at all in season 1.
Yeah.
And I know that this was a very important episode to Melissa Navia. But the irony is, this isn't an Ortegas backstory episode as much as just a Ortegas fundamental story about who she is as a person.
Yeah.
Unless you were zooming in, as I was, on her personnel record to see her birth date, and stuff like that.
I was not. Because I know you're going to, so I don't have to. It's like saving me the trouble.
Because I still want to learn more about her as a war veteran and what it was like for her, because she has a different perspective than Mabenga on the war. She kind of, I don't know, it looks like she almost misses it at times.
Yeah, maybe the action was something. I liked, by the way, that Mabenga was pissed that he was being assigned to a mission because of his combat skills and not his. He was maybe not pissed, like he was disappointed. He
Right.
was he was unhappy with that situation, which I thought was a nice bit of character reveal for him.
Yeah, he doesn't like the fact that he can kick ass.
Yeah,
I could only assume that he only learned that during the war, that he didn't go into the war as ass kicker. It's another thing he carries from the war, his own
right.
skill.
Which is why he doesn't like to bring it up again. Although he does, I mean, he does carry that super serum, but I guess he forgot.
Well, they weren't allowed to bring anything high tech,
I know.
but you know what? You could have given him a knife or a sword or
Yeah.
a crossbow.
I also thought maybe some food, some nutrition bars would have been good.
No, here's a compass and an
Yeah.
old telescope,
There,
and that's it.
there are definitely some things that could have helped with that. But I get it. That's fine. Like that stuff was fine because it sort of helps build the story and give you all the ingredients.
They introduced a new piece of tech in this episode because they were obviously going to send them out without communicators, and we've been led to believe, even though it makes no sense, that the communicators magically make people able to talk to each other and no one could tell the sound is coming from this thing in your pocket.
Or that their lips are moving, but different sounds are coming out.
Right.
But that's like the history of all Star Trek.
That's nothing new,
Yes.
but what they meant, so in this episode, they have subdermal universal translators, which I don't think we've heard that before. But
Nope.
Pike hand waved away why they weren't carrying their communicators with them, but they have subdermal. You know.
Which he conveniently explained to us because obviously they knew that they had them because they had to get them put in.
But then they left the I mean, it was in the middle of nowhere, but they left the shuttle just sitting there.
Know.
You know,
and this is again like where there are a few holes for me, and one of them was like, so did they take 6 more hours to get back? We know that they were at least 6 hours from the shuttle. How did they get La'an to the palace? Like, why do I have to fill in those blanks in my head while I'm watching?
well,
But she was. Mabenga's out there losing his memory again. She's out there. Everybody, like, it seems, I would think they'd come back and find Mabenga's wandered off. He left him fighting a bunch of guards and said, I don't know what he said, like, fight them off and go inside and lock yourself in.
but
I didn't know
if you can make it to the shuttle in a day, you're fine. So one person, probably Pike, left early in the morning, made it. Oh, well, they had his helmet. Took a helmet, went to the shuttle, flew it back.
But I don't know why we have to make all that up. All I'm saying is that's a part of the story as I was watching it, because I thought, oh, now as soon as like he figures out, oh, he found all the equipment and whatever. And I think, oh, now we're going to see him go find La'an. And that's going to be an interesting scene where maybe they've already forgotten who they are again. And he has to remind them and he's going to show them. Nope, she's just there getting bandaged up. So sometimes they just choose the parts of the story that
where they hit the fast forward key. I mean, this episode was already 57 minutes long. They've been running long lately. And I mean, that's great. It's on a streaming service. They don't need to stick to 44 minutes with commercials.
And the only part that felt extraneous to me was all the romancy stuff with her, which I didn't care about. But I felt like all the other stuff sort of developed the pace was good.
I mean, I feel like they're going somewhere with that. I mean, certainly in my interview with Anson, they talked about that. So I think, we've seen her in the trailers too. So maybe something tragic is coming up with Patel, but for whatever reason, they need to establish. This episode established that he loves her. Yeah. It's not just a little little fling thing. She gave him the pendant and he held on to it. It was the only, and
I just would have been fine without all of it. And if it's building up to something, I feel like, wow, that's probably not going to land for me. We'll see how it goes. I like a little romance here and there, but this just isn't. I'm not feeling this one.
Okay.
Can't help it. But there were other bits and pieces along the way, and I don't think I need to go through each one, but I will just say there were maybe 5 or 6 times in this episode where I was like, wait, what? How did they do that? I don't understand this. What happened? And I wish that they would tie up some of those loose ends.
Yeah, there's certainly elements where you can sort out how they could have solved the problem. They could have used the computer or whatever. But for them, it's always what's the emotional story they could tell, and does that get in the way of that? But I've got a different kind of profound question.
Okay.
Is this show living up to its promise to be episode of the week? And I say that because the serialization of the character stories are now getting to the point where I wonder if you could just drop into one of these. Like, imagine dropping into this one and it's like, who's this Battelle woman? Like, you need to know some of these relationships. And is that a risk?
Right. It's not so much that you need to know them, but they certainly add layers while you're watching to give it more meaning. I think if you just watch that episode out of the blue, you'd go, oh, I guess they have a history where something happened. And you would know that. You wouldn't know what it was.
I mean, it's certainly not like watching episode 4 of a season of Discovery where you really need to watch that previously on because you'd be completely lost otherwise.
Right. Or landing in the middle of like the Dominion War and one of those, 5-episode arcs that they were having near the end.
But I guess, they've always said that this character continuation stuff is important. And I always agree, if Captain Kirk, if Edith Keeler dies, he's not going to forget the next week.
Right.
But there's always going to be a risk of a show becoming so much about these relationships and the emotions of the characters that it gets soapy, and you do need to know all that stuff for it to work with you.
Right. Whereas I feel like, let's say Deep Space Nine and Voyager, who had more character growth, like Next Generation, some, but a lot of them kind of had to stay the same for whatever reasons. Those two shows had a lot of character growth, but not in that soapy way that you're talking about.
Yeah, but if you had Voyager on shuffle and and suddenly it's like you see Tom and B'Elanna in one episode from season 1 and then they're married, if you watch an episode from season 6 or 7, you're like, what the hell's so.
Right. You're like, oh, he was a real sleazebag and now he seems like this devoted, upstanding guy. And that was some nice growth that he had.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's bad.
Yeah.
That show did actually have a surprising amount of that. So, I guess I'm not saying this is a problem. I'm just curious as to how far they're going to go with this and how it will impact the sampleability of the show, as it were.
I think it's a good question. And I'd be interested to find someone who's watching it that way, to find out, because I feel like that's the only way that you can find out.
I'm not sure, I've got a lot more to say about this episode. I liked it, and I feel like we know these characters better. It's kind of middle of the pack for the season so far.
Yeah. I mean, overall, like, again, I could at any time list off like 5 other things that didn't make sense to me. But I do think that the concept was really good and it had some good twists. So, yeah, middle of the road.
But I think I liked it more than you did because I'm saying middle of the road is actually good.
Well, I get more frustrated than you do with this show in general because those things that trip me up really trip me up and I'm not even looking for them. They just keep hitting me where I'm like, you guys just said this. Why are you doing that? I just keep feeling their manipulation of events as I watch. And that part, it feels not like, oh, that would make sense in the story so much as, oh, well, I want this character in this place doing this thing. So I'm just going to do it. But I enjoy the individual scenes. I especially loved all the Ortegas stuff. I loved her in the turbolift just being like talking. And then when she's in her quarters and she's like, miss, ma'am, like trying to get the computer to talk to her and all that stuff is fun to watch and entertaining.
Yeah, because how would she know it's a computer? No, I loved that.
Yeah, it was terrific. And
I'm thinking about Picard season 3, which we loved, but we kept on talking about how they were taking shortcuts to get where they wanted to go.
Yeah, they did it there too.
Sometimes, you'll let something go and sometimes you won't. And I guess it's maybe what else you've got going on. What's the package? Was the journey worth it?
Right. And look, but I also think when I've kind of been thinking about Picard a little bit lately and thinking like it really was more about like, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, versus some of those big conceptual ideas that Strange New Worlds is doing. Like Strange New Worlds is coming up with, what about a crazy planet where people lose their memories every night and then create a whole system whereby they can remind themselves of where they live and who they are? That's a really interesting concept. And Picard was more about like, what if this thing happened to this guy that you know and love? right?
Yeah.
So, and I loved Picard season 3. I don't know that I would have loved it if I didn't watch and love Next Generation, and if I hadn't had bad Picard before that. I mean, season 2 in particular.
Yeah.
So you got to put all those things together. But I think with Strange New Worlds, I just too often, and I did feel this during Picard, and I did complain about it, the manipulation.
Okay.
Like the puppet master. Maybe that's, my dad sometimes calls himself the puppet master. But like the puppet master pulling the strings.
An interesting take. We'll have to talk about that more, and I'm curious to hear what our audience thinks on that
Yeah.
level.
I won't disagree with you that I have been inconsistent.
Okay, so let's take our bits of the week. This week, why don't you start?
All right, mine is this crazy thing. So there's a Twitter account called the Wolf 359 Project, and they posted in the last few days this incredible. It's basically a book in digital form, almost 500 pages long, called "We Have Engaged the Borg: An Oral History of Wolf 359." There are two guys behind it, although they had help with illustrators and other writers. Their names are Andy. Now he gave me the pronunciation, so let's hope I don't screw it up. So Andy Perlicides and Eric V. Muirhead. They're going to be like, what did you just do to our names? But anyway, it is a collection of, it's so well done. The design is beautiful. It's people's personal like logs, descriptions, interviews from characters we know: Shelby, Sonia Gomez, Riker, Boothby, Jake Sisko, Marie Picard, Gul Macet, like Dr. Zimmerman, all these different people giving their memories of what was going on during Wolf 359. We have briefings from admirals and transcripts of those briefings. They said it took them about 15 months to get the whole thing written. It looks like a finished book. They did it as a fan project, but I hope they can sell it because it is worthy.
It's very cool. I imagine they were taking as inspiration. There's a famous book called The Good War by Studs Terkel, an oral history of World War II. He kind of pioneered this style. And it's kind of that, except it's the Boer War instead of World War II. And there's a great Max Brooks book about the zombie war done in the same style. Yeah, no, I'm very impressed with that, and really hats off to those guys.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's so well done. All right, what's yours?
Mine is another book. This book was brought to my attention by Danish House, who's our in-house fiction reviewer, and he happens to be a minister, and he wanted to review this book called Soul Boom, A Spiritual Revolution. It's written by none other than Rainn Wilson, and Rainn has had this kind of spiritual epiphany, and he has a very interesting, unique take on life, and he uses Star Trek and Kung Fu through this book as these framing devices for life lessons and a journey of spirituality. And so there's a review on our site, and I think it's just kind of cool. You know, Rainn Wilson's a huge Star Trek fan before he ever showed up on the show.
He has been forever. So when I went to see him in New York City with BJ Novak, also from The Office, but to talk about this book. So they did a great talk about it. He went through a lot of the concepts in it and his inspiration for it. And we bought the book. I was with my son. My son took it. So I haven't read it yet. So now I'm even more excited to read it.
Because it's on. I admit I haven't read it yet. I love the fact that it exists. It's on my list to read, and I'm glad that Danish brought it to our attention so that we could share it with our readers, because it's not something we usually would do, but it's interesting.
Here's something he said at that talk that I found very interesting that I brought up in our podcast with the Shuttle Pod folks about Prodigy, which was that he says, don't be cynical, because when you're cynical, they win because you don't do anything. You decide you can't change anything. And that was my big takeaway from that night as a way of thinking about things, is don't be cynical. It's bad. So I liked everything he had to say philosophically that night. So sounds like a good book. One other thing we wanted to mention this week is that, there's always something new popping up in place of Twitter. But the current one that everybody seems to be checking out is called Blue Sky, and TrekMovie is there. So if you get your Blue Sky invite, come on over and find us.
And so to find us on Blue Sky, what would someone do?
You could just go in and search TrekMovie and you'll find us.
All right.
It's easy. You don't have to know which server we're on. You don't have to do all that. And who knows, Blue Sky could go away just like everything else and everybody goes running back to Twitter. I don't know what's going to go down, but we're there.
Just in case.
Just in case. We've staked a claim.
And with that, thank you again. We'll be back next Friday because if it's Friday, it's All Access Star Trek.
See ya.